Carolyn Arntzen and Denise Hatch enter Wilhelm's Portland Memorial Funeral Home on a mission. They're searching for 3 boxes of cremated remains.
Just found out this morning we have a couple who are missing, so we're going to be back out looking for them today.
These remains belong to veterans who never received a proper burial or internment. They've sat on a shelf in the dark corners of this mausoleum, in some cases for more than 100 years.
And then there are just rows and rows and rows of cardboard boxes. There's some...
Arntzen and Hatch have spent the past few years sorting through thousands of abandoned remains with one goal in mind: to find the veterans and get them interred at Willamette National Cemetery.
I found William Henry Conrad, I found Frederick Failing, but I cannot find William James Backman.
From the newsroom of OPB, I'm Jen Chavez, and this is The Evergreen, a podcast about the place you call home. Today, we're bringing you the story of 2 women who spent years sifting through boxes of ashes to give Oregon veterans a proper burial.
Was it they didn't have the money? Were they the last of the family? Were they hard to get along with and everybody was not interested in helping them? But it makes me very sad.
You know, on the one hand, people may think, oh, because it's been so long, it's just not as important, but it's just as if they recently passed. And it's wonderful to be able to be part of recognizing their service and to remind people that they mattered.
And here to give us an inside look is OPB General Assignment Reporter Joni Auden-Land, who's been following these women on their journey. Joni, hello. Thank you for being with us.
Glad to be here.
So, Joni, you've been spending a lot of time in funeral homes, getting to know Carolyn Arntzen and Denise Hatch. How did they begin their work searching for abandoned remains?
So for context, there's this website called findagrave.com, and you can kind of think of it as like an online database for graves and cemeteries around the country. You want to find your great-grandfather who died 80 years ago and see where he's buried. You can look it up, and there will be a picture of his grave and so on. And so both of them, Carolyn and Denise, use this website a lot and like to catalog people who have passed away. And in this work, they found that it's pretty common for people to not actually be interred, to have a box of cremated ashes, and they look like maybe like Christmas presents you'd see like in the 1930s. I mean, they're these not ornate boxes, not like the fancy urns you might think of when you think of cremated remains at all. That were never interred and just kind of sit on a back shelf in a funeral home. And in this work, they also realized that many of these people are veterans who, served this country in some branch, in some form, but again, were never given a proper burial, a proper sort of ceremony like that. And both these women also have veterans in their own personal families. So they told me they felt it was a very like personal mission for them to sort of make sure these people received a burial.
Mm-hmm. And you followed them to Wilhelm's Portland Memorial Funeral Home, which is the oldest crematory west of the Mississippi and home to nearly 100,000 deceased people. What were your impressions of that place?
That place is crazy, Jen.
Yeah, I bet.
Let me try to set the picture here. It's kind of a difficult place to describe if you've never been to it before. It's 8 stories tall, and you kind of enter in on the 4th floor. And each floor and each part of each floor has like a different design. So you walk on one floor and it's like Spanish revivalist. Another floor will be like Italian Renaissance style.
Oh.
One floor will be like late 19th century Gothic style. Another one you feel like you're like in a fishbowl kind of, because all the windows have this weird green glass to it. It's very disorienting and it's very easy to get lost. We got lost when I was walking around with them around it.
Where are we? We can't get out from here.
I thought this went down though.
I did too.
Let's try this way.
Again, if you're walking around, what you wouldn't know is that in addition to all these weird, sort of like haunted house looking chambers where people are buried and there's just so many graves that you wouldn't believe. In addition to that, there are closets where there are people being kept, again, these little boxes that nobody claimed. And in this one, there are 2,000 boxes, basically. And if you were to go in, kind of imagine the last scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark, right?
Right,
Where
yeah.
like it's floor to ceiling all the way back of just boxes and boxes and boxes of like unclaimed remains, basically.
Wow. Yeah, that is an extremely vivid picture, and 2000 is just so many. So you were there with Carolyn and Denise. What was it like seeing them and their work in action?
It was kind of interesting coming in at the tail end of what they're doing, because you could tell they've been doing this a lot, and they've spent a ton of hours in this funeral home sort of sifting through boxes. And it was very like almost procedural in a way where they're like, we have this name, we got to find this name, got to get the box in there. And they didn't seem really overwhelmed by the environment at all, at least compared to me. I was a little overwhelmed by the amount of, it's hard to escape the kind of auspices of death that exist in this place, but they seem sort of unfazed by it in some strange way.
That's so interesting. I am curious. They're sorting through all of these boxes, hoping to find specific people. So are these boxes of unclaimed remains like labeled with the person's name and information, or is it like a bit more complicated than that? I know they've been working on this for years. So
ideally, they have names on them.
Oh, okay.
For some context, this funeral home opened in 1901, right? So you have people that have been buried there and have been sitting on these shelves since the early 1900s. So over time, these boxes have degraded and kind of fallen apart over time. Maybe the pencil that had their name written on it has faded. So there's just a box and there's no database for it, so you'll have no idea who is actually in that box, basically. There is no database. Every single person is kept on what looks like a little library card. This is a huge room full of like library catalog drawers with names in it.
Oh, so like old-timey card catalog in a library.
Literally, I observed them sort of like go through them and like pick through the cards and pull a name out and say, oh, that's John Smith or whoever, you know? That's how they found all these people. They had to go through every single card and see who were listed as abandoned or like in the tower, they call it.
Yeah, it's so interesting to think of this as kind of like a library.
And the unfortunate thing is, along with that, is that some of these boxes are kind of in terrible condition. There was one point we were there where they pulled out a box of they were trying to find in, and you see a stream of ash pour out the corner.
Oh, no.
And they had to get duct tape and wrap it up.
You need tape? What kind of tape do you need?
Tape to tape up the three sides of one of them that's
Falling apart. Okay, well, let's help her do that.
They said it's not uncommon to go where you think you're going to find a box and just see a pile of ash instead, because it's 80 years old and it just sort of disintegrated over time.
Wow. So the phenomenon of cremated ashes being left abandoned at funeral homes is very common.
Every funeral home I've ever worked at has a closet full of unclaimed cremated remains.
That was Robert Gaskell, owner of Estacada Funeral Chapel. And Joni, you learned that funeral homes all over the country have remains that loved ones never picked up. And of course, that includes the funeral home that you visited. They have over 2,000. Did anyone you met reflect on why that is? What the different reasons could be that a person's remains could go unclaimed?
There's kind of a myriad of reasons. I think, there might be a perception that, maybe they were unhoused or just, kind of a shut-in or something like that. And it's actually more complicated than that. Robert, for example, was telling me that it could just be that they lived in Oregon, for example, but maybe their family lived on the East Coast. And back in the day, it's a little harder to come over there and pick up remains. And they say, oh, I'll do it. Oh, I'll do it. Oh, I'll do it. And it never happens, basically.
Right.
And then it kind of gets lost to time. It could just be a simple scheduling kind of conflict. Fairly often, actually, they were babies that would be left sort of by their parents when they passed away. Back in the day, I think it was more common, and this is what I've heard from Robert and Carolyn and other funeral industry workers, that it was more common for parents when they lost a child decades ago to sort of, rather than confront the grief that comes with that, sort of just to hand remains over to a funeral home and pretend like it didn't happen. Have it something you don't talk about, really.
I wonder if, for some people, it's kind of hard to face the death of their loved one in this very, physical way of going and getting their ashes. That's something that came up for me.
Robert told me this one anecdote of, in his smaller funeral home, I think he probably has a dozen, or so boxes. And one of them is this, old couple.
I have a set of cremated remains, a husband and wife that were killed in a car accident when the son was little. And the son's wife called me up and said, hey, I want to work on getting these ashes back to, it's for closure for him. So let me see if my husband will do this. And she said he doesn't want any part of it. So
I wonder why.
Because he'd have to deal with it then.
As you said, yeah, that's really tough for some people to really like reckon with death in such a physical kind of way, right?
Yeah. Did you get a sense of how this makes Denise and Carolyn feel? Like going through all of these abandoned remains, being in this environment where they're surrounded by these remains that were never claimed. Like, does it make them sad?
I think it did at one point. It's hard to not kind of be sad when you have this sort of like immense amount of death kind of surrounding you while doing this. But they've been doing it for so long. And when talking to them, they kind of described it as a calling. Like this was sort of their purpose in life, was to sort of help these people return a home in a way. So I think because of that mission-driven aspect to it, they aren't bothered by the sadness of it all. In fact, there's sort of a happy aspect to it because if they're successful, these people won't have to be in this sort of like sad situation anymore. And that was evident when I was joining them at the cemetery as well. There was a portion, and I couldn't be here, so Carolyn was nice enough to get this on her phone for me, where they were looking for these boxes. And you can kind of just hear the joy in their voices when they found it. You know, it's sort of, it's hard to, it's maybe a little too glib to describe it as like treasure hunting in a way, but it's sort of like you've been looking for something for so long and it's there, and they sound really overcome with joy.
And what's his first name?
William Backman.
B-A-C-K-M-A-N.
Okay,
got it. Backman.
Backman.
William, where are you?
Mr. Backman. I found him! Oh, praise God! Oh, I'm so excited.
Coming up after a short break, we'll learn more about the found veterans and their stories. Stay with us. So, Joni, these two women worked on this for years. How many remains have Carolyn and Denise found?
So the process was kind of, again, going through all those little library cards I was telling you about and kind of matching them to the boxes. And so they actually cataloged all 2,000 of those boxes and put them on findagrave.com for people to find. Of those 2,000, they were able to identify 34 remains that were able and qualified to be buried in Willamette National Cemetery. It's kind of a process, actually, to go to the federal government and try to get these remains interred. There's a lot of paperwork involved.
I can imagine, yeah.
It wasn't just they found 34 remains, it's 34 people who were qualified enough to actually get in there. You know, did they have the social security numbers? Did they have records of service? And again, these people didn't have people in their life for the most part, so records were very hard to find for the most part.
Yeah, and I think probably like some people maybe didn't have social security numbers because that wasn't a thing.
Exactly. Again, some of these people served in the Civil War. So to kind of give you context of how old some of these remains were.
Okay, well, let's get into that. What did you learn about the 34 found veterans and their stories?
You know, their backgrounds and their stories are extremely varied. You know, they served in all different branches. They served in the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, both world wars. One story that stuck out to me was a nurse named Winifred Mayberry who served in World War I. She was born in England, came to Canada before moving to Oregon, and she eventually signed up to serve as a nurse in France. There's also a baby whose father served in the Navy, so he was able to be buried in the cemetery as a dependent. But honestly, beyond that, specific details are kind of scant about these people. Again, if there had been more details and more records, possibly that we could have found their families and they would have been able to be buried, you know, by their descendants. But much of their details, again, on those little library cards I was telling you about, where it might have some details about why they were abandoned, but not much. Sarah Lewis, one of the employees from the cemetery, actually showed me one of these cards.
This is his wife. May 20th, 1930, she came in and she wanted to remove him and give him a respectful placement here in the mausoleum. And looks like she never came back and did that. So for whatever reason in her life, you know.
Yeah, I mean, it's still interesting to know little pieces of information about these people and who they were. And you followed this story through, and you attended a ceremony for these veterans at Willamette National Cemetery.
Good morning. My name is Carolyn Arnson. Today marks the end of searching and researching a multitude of stored, unclaimed remains for men and women we believed were United States veterans.
And as you can hear, there were bagpipes to honor the 34 veterans who received full military honors. Joni, tell us what that ceremony was like, what being there was like.
It's interesting. I'm an Eagle Scout. I've been to a lot of veterans ceremonies, a lot of even veterans funerals. My grandfather, when he passed away, was a veteran. He had a full ceremony. But this was kind of on another level, just sort of the pageantry. I mean, a lot of people showed up, and a lot of them were wearing Civil War regalia, World War I regalia.
Wow.
People really went out and really dressed up for the occasion. But it was still very solemn. It was it was a gigantic funeral, basically. And I was amazed how emotional it was, considering that nobody there knew these people. Nobody knew what their lives were like, really. But yet everybody, it was like seeing your family members being buried. There was one moment in particular where they were singing the national anthem, and it was just one man, the color guard, who started singing it, but then everybody started joining in, which I don't know what caught me off guard.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming?
And it was this really emotional moment, kind of as rain is starting to pitter patter around it. Really kind of sunk in for me personally that wow, this is a really heavy, beautiful moment in a way.
Yeah. I mean, how did it feel for Denise and Carolyn? Did you talk to them?
Yeah, I think for them it was also pretty emotional. I mean, again, this is the better part of a decade that they spent dedicated to this. So kind of seeing it come to fruition and sort of achieve their goal, that was, I think, really emotional for them, but also a sense of satisfaction that we did right by these people by doing this. I talked to Denise after it happened, and she was fairly emotional.
How are you feeling right now?
Very emotional. Sorry.
Take your time.
Because we worked so long trying to bring the veterans together.
See what we can do.
And now it's just the culmination. It's a good day. I'm glad they're finally here.
On the one hand, people may think, because it's been so long, it's just not as important, but it's just as if they recently passed. And it's wonderful to be able to be part of recognizing their service and to remind people that they mattered.
Yeah, and I mean, maybe that's why it was so powerful for everyone else there, that idea of something is being done to do right by these people.
There were a lot of tears, for sure. Again, for people who, died so long ago, the sheer amount of emotion was definitely a surprise.
Mm-hmm. And, as we mentioned, Denise and Carolyn worked towards this for a very long time, and the ceremony happened. Now that these veterans have been recognized like this and properly interred, do you think they'll continue this type of work, helping to find abandoned remains for others in the future?
It's funny. I know Carolyn in particular told me that she promised her husband that this would be the last time and that she'd be taking a break.
It was a long journey, but I'm not sorry at all that I spent the last 12 years or so doing this, because I feel like they deserved better than what they were getting. So I'm happy. Will I do more? Maybe, probably, but I'm going to take a rest for a little while.
I was told that this is not the first time, that we have found veterans whose remains were abandoned. I know we had a similar case in Roseburg not too long ago, where a dozen or so were found. It is not uncommon. So I think this is something that these two women and other organizations are going to keep doing, because, again, it is all too common, and there are always sort of remains there to find and help inter.
Yeah, and I imagine if I found out that I was like a family member or a descendant of one of these people, that like knowing something like this was happening and being paid attention to would like mean a lot to me. And Joni, I know you worked on this story for like over 2 months, so you spent a good amount of time getting to know these two women and experiencing some of the work that they've been doing for a really long time to help find these abandoned remains. Now you have finished this story. You can step back and look at their journey. What do you think is so significant about this story? What made you want to tell this for OPB's listeners and audience?
I think I've been struck by the dedication. You know, Jen, I think if somebody came to us and said, hey, you want to achieve this goal, it's going to take you 10 years to do. Like, we're not going to do that.
Yeah.
We're not going to do that thing. We're like, I'm okay. I won't do that. But that did not faze them, 2 years in, 5 years in, they kept at it and really felt like this was, again, their mission in life, in a sense, was to help these veterans in a way. I just think that's kind of remarkable. I don't hear too many stories of people sort of like dedicating themselves to something, frankly, as thankless as this can be, going through all these remains. And just, I think it's relatable. I think, none of us want our loved ones to be in a situation where, again, they're on a shelf collecting dust for decades and decades and decades. It's gotten me thinking about just how we sort of like treat our dead and what our standards are for that, and how we can like go back in time and sort of, I guess, make amends for what we weren't able to do when these people actually died. It's definitely gotten me thinking about my own life and, the family members I have had that pass away, and how do I do right by them, when that happens.
I mean, your story had me thinking about that in my own life as well. And I think about how, people continue to exist in our memories of them. And to me, this story was so about doing right by that memory. And so I really love that you told this story.
Exactly. This is a veteran story because we're talking about veterans specifically, and that was sort of their motivation for finding these people. But I think it's obviously about more than just that, because these people had, full lives outside of their service as well, that I think whether or not, they served, they still deserve like a proper burial. No one deserves to be, left on a dank shelf for eternity.
Yeah. Well, Joni, thank you so much for coming by and sharing some of your reporting and your experience with us today.
This has been great. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. That was OPB General Assignment reporter Joni Auden Land. You can find a link to their coverage of this incredible story in our show notes. Thank you for listening to The Evergreen, a podcast from OPB. And if you're here listening right now, you are part of our brand new podcast family. And we want to take a minute to shout out some of our lovely listeners who've been leaving such kind comments about our show online. A user called Meanness left us a review on Apple Podcasts saying, quote, I love this new podcast series. I feel the topics are important as an Oregonian and also very kind and thoughtful ways for us to consider the issues we face. I appreciate the hard work they do to put out this great series. Thank you for being a positive force for good in our great state. Oh my gosh, that is what I love to hear. Thank you so much for your kind words. Meanwhile, Joe Morris left us a comment on Facebook reacting to our episode about spiritual group Twin Ray called Is There a Cult in Ashland? Joe said, quote, Netflix, Amazon, and Hulu are tripping over themselves just from this headline and image. Also, if Leah Satilia is writing about you, you are probably in a cult, end quote. An audience member on YouTube also reacted to our Twin Ray episode and said, hey, what a great podcast. Thank you for putting this on. It's always fun to hear such startling things and such hot, bloody messes are taking place all over the country. End quote. Ain't that the truth? Thank you again for all your comments and reflections. We appreciate you so much. I, in particular, love to hear from y'all, so thank you. Help us grow by leaving a review, just like one of those, perhaps, on your favorite podcast app, including YouTube. Follow us there, and hey, tell your friends. Mia Estrada produced this episode, and our technical director is Stephen Cray. He also engineered the episode. The OPB podcast team also includes Julie Sabatier and Sage Van Wing. Joni Auden Land did the interviews you heard. We also got help from Julia Bobach. The music in this episode is from Audio Network. And hey, if you ever have a question for us, don't forget that you can hit us up. You can reach us by email at theevergreen@opb.org. I'm Jen Chavez. Catch you later.
Where is the Ark? The Ark is a source of unspeakable power, and it has to be researched.
And it will be, I assure you, Dr. Brody, Dr. Jones. We have top men working on it right now. Who? Top.